The Legend of Misunderstood Shadows, a tale of the Tarot Kingdom, the whispered fears. In the outer provinces of the Tarot Kingdom, where superstition grew thick as brambles and fear cast shadows longer than truth, two names were spoken only in whispers: Death and the Devil. Mothers hushed children who dared utter these syllables. Merchants crossed themselves when passing certain roads, and even the bravest knights would take lengthy detours to avoid encounters with these dreaded figures. Yet in the heart of the kingdom, where wisdom flowed like clear water from ancient springs, the Council of Archetypes watched with growing concern as these misunderstandings poisoned the very air. For they knew what the fearful citizens did not, that death was perhaps the gentlest soul in all the realm, and the devil, far from the omnipotent tempter of legend, was little more than a sophisticated illusionist whose power existed primarily in the minds of those who believed in it. Death, the gentle gardener, the truth behind the scythe. In a cottage at the edge of the eternal gardens, where seasons turned in perfect harmony and every ending birthed a new beginning, lived the one known as Death. Death! The cottage itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of natural cycles. Its walls grew thick with ivy that died and regrew with each passing month. Its roof was thatched with grasses that turned golden, fell, and sprouted anew in endless rotation. Death himself bore little resemblance to the skeletal specter of popular imagination. Tall and graceful, with hands that moved like benedictions and eyes that held the depth of starlit nights, he tended his garden with the patience of one who understood that every ending was also a beginning. His famous scythe, the tool that had inspired so much terror, was not a weapon, but a gardener's implement, used to harvest what had ripened and clear space for new growth. Each morning, Death would walk among his plantings, speaking softly to flowers that had bloomed their fullest and were ready to release their seeds, to trees whose branches had grown heavy with age and were prepared to return their strength to the soil. His touch did not destroy but transformed, allowing each living thing to complete its natural cycle with dignity and purpose. People fear me because they misunderstand my nature. Death would sometimes muse to the wind, which carried his words to any who might listen. They see ending and think destruction, when what I offer is completion. They see change and think loss, when what I bring is transformation. The rejected invitations. Despite his gentle nature, Death found himself increasingly isolated as his reputation grew more fearsome with each retelling. Citizens who might have benefited from his wisdom, those struggling to let go of relationships that had run their course, artists unable to complete their works, leaders clinging to power long past their effective tenure, avoided him entirely. The kingdom's healers, who should have been his natural allies in helping people navigate life's transitions, instead viewed him as their enemy. They fought against every natural ending, prolonging suffering in their misguided belief that any cessation was failure. Families kept vigil over loved ones who were ready to depart, begging death to stay away, not understanding that their fear was causing more pain than peace. Even the other archetypes began to distance themselves. The Tower, whose purpose was sudden, necessary upheaval, started handling his own business rather than calling upon Death's gentler expertise in helping people process the aftermath of dramatic change. The Star, who should have worked closely with Death to help souls find hope after loss, instead focused only on inspiration, while avoiding the necessary clearing that made space for new dreams. They send messengers asking me to take their enemies, Death confided to his garden, his voice heavy with sadness. They petition me to spare their loved ones, as if I were some cosmic executioner rather than a midwife of transition. They understand nothing of my true work. The Unfinished Symphony. The crisis reached its peak during the Great Stagnation, a period when the kingdom seemed frozen in perpetual incompletion. Projects begun with enthusiasm languished half-finished. Relationships that had served their purpose dragged on in mutual resentment. Leaders who had lost their vision clung to power through fear rather than wisdom. The natural flow of endings and beginnings had been so thoroughly disrupted by fear of death that the kingdom itself began to suffocate under the weight of things that would not conclude. It was during this time that Death made a decision that would forever change how he was perceived. Rather than waiting for invitation or acceptance, he began to walk openly through the kingdom's streets, carrying not his scythe, but a different tool entirely, a silver bell whose chimes carried the music of completion. The devil, the paper tiger, the illusion of omnipotence. Meanwhile, in his obsidian tower that thrust toward the sky like a crystallized ego, the being known as the devil was experiencing his own crisis of identity. For centuries, he had cultivated a reputation as the master tempter, the corrupter of souls, the adversary against whom all righteous beings must struggle. Yet the truth was far more mundane and considerably more embarrassing. The devil was, at his core, nothing more than an exceptionally skilled magician whose greatest trick was convincing others of his own importance. The tower itself was the devil's masterwork of illusion. It appeared to be a fortress of dark power, its walls inscribed with fearsome symbols and its chambers filled with the tools of temptation. Yet anyone who looked closely, and few dared to look at all, would have seen that the symbols were merely decorative. The chambers were theatrical sets, and the supposed instruments of corruption were props in an elaborate performance that had gone on so long, the performer himself sometimes forgot it was just a show. The devil's true nature was that of the eternal middle manager, a bureaucrat of minor temptations whose actual influence was limited to those who chose to give him power over their lives. He could offer nothing that people did not already desire, create no urges that did not already exist, force no choices that individuals were not already inclined to make. His chains bound only those who believed they were bound. His contracts held power only over those who signed them willingly. "They credit me with far too much," the devil would sometimes admit to his reflection in the polished obsidian walls. "They make me responsible for their choices, as if I could compel what they themselves decide. They fear my power while giving me the only power I actually possess, their belief in my authority over them." The addiction to opposition, yet despite, or perhaps because of, his limited actual influence, the devil found himself trapped in a role that the kingdom seemed to need him to play. Citizens who made poor choices found it easier to blame his temptation than accept responsibility for their own decisions. Leaders who abused their power claimed his influence rather than acknowledging their own corruption. Even the virtuous seemed to require his existence as a measuring stick for their own righteousness. The other archetypes, who should have seen through his theatrical presentation, instead played along with the charade. The tower enjoyed having a rival in the business of dramatic revelation. The Hierophant used the devil as a convenient example of everything he opposed. Even Death, in his loneliness, sometimes welcomed the devil's company, though he saw clearly through the performance to the insecure actor beneath. "They need me to be powerful," the devil realized with growing unease. "Because if I am not the great corrupter, then they must face the truth that their struggles are with themselves. If I cannot make them choose evil, then they must acknowledge that evil is a choice they make freely." The devil's tower became increasingly elaborate as he tried to live up to his reputation, but the more effort he put into the illusion, the more hollow it became. He threw grander parties to demonstrate his influence over the wealthy and powerful, but attendance dropped as people began to realize that his gatherings were just expensive theater. He crafted more ingenious temptations, but found that people were quite capable of tempting themselves without his assistance. The empty throne. The breaking point came during the kingdom's annual assembly of shadows, where all the dark archetypes were expected to present their plans for the coming year. The devil arrived in his most impressive costume, surrounded by the full pageantry of his supposed power, prepared to deliver a speech about his schemes for corruption and chaos. But when he looked out at the assembled crowd, citizens who had come expecting to see the master of evil himself, all he could feel was the weight of their projected fears and his own fraudulent performance. These people didn't need a devil to make poor choices. They were perfectly capable of selfishness, cruelty, and short-sighted decisions without any supernatural assistance. His presence was not corrupting them. Their belief in his corruption was corrupting their own ability to take responsibility for their actions. In a moment of unprecedented honesty, the devil did something that shocked the entire assembly. He removed his elaborate horned crown and set it on the podium before him. "I resign," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "I resign from being your scapegoat, your excuse, your projection of everything you refuse to own about yourselves. Find another actor for this role, or better yet, face the truth that you are the authors of your own stories, both light and dark." The meeting of misunderstood souls. The garden encounter. It was inevitable that Death and the Devil would eventually find each other, drawn together by the shared experience of being fundamentally misunderstood by the very kingdom they served. They met in Death's garden on an autumn evening when the air itself seemed to shimmer with the magic of transition. Death was tending to a bed of chrysanthemums, their golden petals just beginning to loosen and fall when the Devil appeared at his garden gate. Without the theatrical costume and supernatural aura, the Devil looked remarkably ordinary, tired, somewhat lost, but also relieved to be free of his performed identity. "May I enter?" the Devil asked, his voice carrying none of its usual dramatic resonance. "I find myself in need of an ending, and they say you are the expert in such matters." Death smiled, the expression transforming his features from austere to unexpectedly warm. "Only if you understand that endings are also beginnings and that what dies in my garden was already ready to transform. I cannot kill what still has life to live." They sat together on a bench carved from driftwood, surrounded by the gentle cycle of the garden's eternal seasons. For the first time in centuries, both beings found themselves in the company of someone who saw them clearly, not as projections of fear or fantasy, but as they actually were. "They made me responsible for their choices," the Devil said, watching a butterfly emerge from a chrysalis on a nearby branch, "as if their free will was my invention rather than their birthright." "And they made me responsible for their fears," Death replied, deadheading a rose that had finished blooming, "as if transition itself was violence rather than the natural flow of existence, the revelation of true roles." As they talked through the night, both beings began to understand how their reputations had grown so far from their actual natures. The kingdom's citizens, uncomfortable with personal responsibility and natural change, had created mythologies that allowed them to avoid facing these uncomfortable truths. Death was feared not because he was cruel, but because he represented the reality that all things, relationships, projects, phases of life, ultimately life itself, had natural cycles of completion. People preferred to see him as an enemy to be fought rather than a teacher to be consulted about how to navigate transitions with grace. The Devil was given power not because he possessed any supernatural ability to compel evil, but because believing in his influence allowed people to avoid confronting their own capacity for selfishness, their own responsibility for the harm they caused. It was easier to battle an external tempter than to acknowledge the shadow aspects of their own nature. "We have become symbols," Death mused, "but symbols of what people refuse to accept about reality, rather than guides to help them navigate that reality with wisdom." "Perhaps," the Devil suggested, "it is time to show them who we really are, regardless of whether they are ready to see." The Great Revelation, Death's public teaching. Death began his revelation gently, as was his nature. He left his cottage and walked openly through the kingdom's streets, no longer hiding from those who feared him. But instead of carrying his scythe, he brought tools of a different sort, a musician's bow that had served its purpose and needed to be retired before it damaged the strings, a sculptor's chisel worn smooth by years of faithful service, a writer's pen that had written its last word and was ready to be honored for its contribution. At the market square, he set up a simple display and began to demonstrate the art of conscious completion. He showed how the musician's bow, rather than being discarded as useless, could be honored in a ceremony that acknowledged its service before it was returned to the earth to nourish the tree from which the next bough would be carved. Citizens gathered, initially from morbid curiosity, but gradually with genuine interest as they began to understand what Death was actually offering. Not destruction, but completion. Not violence, but transformation. Not an end to love, but a deepening of appreciation for what had been shared. A widow approached him cautiously. "My husband died last spring," she whispered, "and everyone says I should get over it and move on. But I can't seem to let go. Death's eyes filled with compassion. Let go of what? He asked gently. The love you shared? The memories that shaped you? The ways he changed you for the better? These are not meant to be discarded. They are meant to be integrated, to become part of who you are now. What needs to die is not your love for him, but your exclusive focus on what was, so that you can also embrace what is and what might be. The devil's confession. The devil's revelation was more dramatic, as befitted his theatrical nature, but equally transformative. He called for a great assembly in the kingdom's central amphitheater and appeared not in his usual costume of horns and flames, but in the simple robes of a teacher. For centuries, he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the amphitheater, you have given me credit for your poor choices. You have blamed me for your selfishness, your cruelty, your short-sighted decisions. You have made me responsible for every impulse you preferred not to own. The crowd murmured uncomfortably, some angry at this undermining of their convenient mythology, others curious about what he would say next. But here is the truth you have refused to face. I have no power to make you choose anything. I cannot create desires that do not already exist within you. I cannot force actions you do not already wish to take. The temptations I offer are merely reflections of what you already want, but are afraid to acknowledge. He gestured to the crowd, his movement encompassing all of them. Your capacity for both good and evil belongs entirely to you. Your struggles with selfishness, your battles with destructive impulses, your wrestling with moral choices, these are the human condition, not supernatural interference. I am not your enemy. I am the mirror you have refused to look into, the shadow you have projected outward rather than integrating within. A merchant stood up, his face red with anger. Are you saying that when I cheated my customers, that was entirely my own doing? That I can't blame you for leading me astray? The devil nodded solemnly. I am saying exactly that. And more importantly, I am saying that acknowledging this is the beginning of your freedom. As long as you believe an external force compels your choices, you remain powerless to change them. When you accept that your choices are yours alone, you reclaim the power to choose differently. The integration. The revelation created upheaval throughout the kingdom, but it was the upheaval of necessary growth rather than destructive chaos. Citizens who had lived in fear of death began to consult him about life transitions, learning to navigate endings with grace and completeness. People who had blamed the devil for their problems began the harder but more empowering work of examining their own motivations and taking responsibility for their choices. The other archetypes, initially resistant to this disruption of familiar patterns, gradually recognized the wisdom in their colleagues' honesty. The star began working closely with death, helping people find hope and direction after necessary endings. The Hierophant collaborated with the devil, now calling himself simply the Shadow Teacher, to help citizens integrate their dark impulses rather than projecting them outward. Death's cottage became a center for those learning the arts of conscious transition, while the Devil's Tower was transformed into a school for psychological integration, where people could safely explore their shadow aspects under guidance rather than acting them out unconsciously in the world. The new understanding Death reborn. In his true role, Death revealed himself as perhaps the most life-affirming of all the archetypes. His garden became a pilgrimage site where people came to learn the secret of living fully, that only by accepting the temporary nature of all things could one fully appreciate their beauty while they lasted. He taught the art of conscious endings, how to complete relationships with gratitude rather than bitterness, how to finish projects with pride rather than regret, how to leave positions of responsibility with grace rather than clinging. His scythe, once a symbol of terror, became understood as a tool of liberation, cutting away what was finished so that new growth could flourish. Children began to visit Death's garden, unafraid because they had not yet learned to fear natural cycles. He taught them to tend plants, showing them how the composted remains of last year's flowers became the rich soil for this year's blooms. Through this simple metaphor, they learned that nothing was ever truly lost, only transformed. Life and death are not opposites. Death would explain to his students, they are dance partners. Life creates, death completes. Together, they make existence meaningful. The shadow teacher emerged. The being formerly known as the devil found his true calling as a teacher of psychological integration. His theatrical skills, once used to maintain false mystique, now served to make complex concepts accessible and engaging. His deep understanding of human psychology, gained through centuries of observing people's projections, made him uniquely qualified to help them reclaim their disowned aspects. His school attracted those brave enough to face their own shadows, leaders who wanted to understand their potential for corruption before it corrupted them, artists who sought to channel their destructive impulses into creative power, ordinary citizens who were tired of being at war with parts of themselves they didn't understand. Your shadow is not your enemy, the shadow teacher would explain. It is the repository of your unlived potential, both destructive and creative. When you refuse to acknowledge it consciously, it acts out unconsciously. When you integrate it with awareness, it becomes a source of authentic power and wisdom. His greatest lesson was perhaps the simplest. Every time you say the devil made me do it, you give away your power to choose differently. Every time you acknowledge I chose this and I can choose again, you reclaim your agency. The legacy of truth, the kingdom transformed, the courage of death and the shadow. Teacher to reveal their true natures catalyzed a transformation throughout the tarot kingdom. Other archetypes began to examine their own reputations, questioning whether they too had been misunderstood or had allowed themselves to be seen in ways that didn't serve the kingdom's highest good. The Tower realized that his reputation for sudden destruction was incomplete. He also needed to be known as the architect of necessary breakthroughs. The Hermit understood that his isolation, while valuable for introspection, needed to be balanced with the wisdom of returning to share what he had learned. Even the Sun began to acknowledge that his relentless optimism sometimes needed to be tempered with realistic assessment. Citizens of the kingdom, freed from their fears of death and their dependence on the devil as scapegoat, began to live with greater authenticity and responsibility. They approached life's transitions with curiosity rather than terror, acknowledged their capacity for both good and evil with honesty rather than projection. The new wisdom. The legend of death and the devil's revelation became a teaching story told throughout the land, but its lessons extended far beyond these two archetypes. It became a parable about the danger of creating mythologies that allow people to avoid difficult truths, about the importance of seeing clearly rather than through the lens of comfortable illusions. Children learned that death was not to be feared but consulted, that transitions were not failures but natural progressions. Adults discovered that taking responsibility for their choices, while more challenging than blaming external forces, was also more empowering. Leaders realized that acknowledging their potential for corruption was the best protection against actually becoming corrupt. The kingdom's wisdom keepers enshrined this understanding in what became known as the principle of clear seeing. When we see the archetypes truly, neither diminishing their power nor inflating their influence beyond reality, we learn to work with the actual forces that shape our lives rather than fighting phantoms of our own creation. The continuing dance. In the end, Death and the Shadow Teacher found that their friendship had grown from their shared experience of being misunderstood into something deeper, a recognition that they were complementary aspects of the same truth. Death helped people complete what was finished so that new life could emerge. The Shadow Teacher helped people integrate what was hidden so that wholeness could be achieved. Their gardens, for the Devil's Tower had been transformed into a different kind of garden, one where the flowers of human psychology bloomed in all their complex beauty, stood side by side, demonstrating that endings and integration, completion and acceptance were not opposing forces, but collaborative ones. Visitors would often find them working together, Death helping someone release an outdated identity so they could grow into their fuller self, while the Shadow Teacher helped that same person acknowledge and integrate the aspects of themselves they had previously rejected. Together, they offered what neither could provide alone, the complete process of conscious transformation. The legend concludes with an image that has become iconic throughout the Tarot Kingdom. Death and the shadow teacher sitting together in the evening light, sharing tea and quiet conversation, surrounded by gardens where nothing was ever truly lost, only transformed, integrated, and made ready for whatever wished to emerge next. Their example continues to remind all who encounter it that truth is often gentler and more complex than fear suggests, that taking responsibility is more empowering than blame, and that understanding the real nature of life's challenges is the beginning of wisdom in facing them. In the mystical geography of the Tarot Kingdom, their story stands as proof that even the most misunderstood souls can find their way to authentic expression when they have the courage to show themselves as they truly are.